Hello, today we're going to be talking about corals and macroalgae. Can you keep them together? Well, obviously, yes you can. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please leave a like and subscribe. No, seriously, I get asked a fair bit actually about keeping macroalgae and corals together, and yeah, on the most part you can keep them together. Lots of people feel like you have to do one or the other, but it's not true. Yeah, you can keep lots of different things together. You have to be careful though. It's not just as easy as banging them all in one tank and them all getting on. So there is a little bit of nuance to it, especially when it comes to hard corals. You have to be a little bit careful. So I'm going to go through really what you should be mindful of if you want to keep corals together with macroalgae. So firstly, let's talk about lighting. There tends to be a slight difference between the lighting that people use for macroalgae than they use for coral. So coral tends to be like 10,000 K to maybe 20,000 K actinics, so heavy on the blue side, not so heavy on the white side. You can see this tank here is quite white and quite vibrant, and that's because it's fluval Bluetooth LED lights, and these lights tend to be a bit whiter than say the full true blue kind of lighting that you get for marine tanks, and that actually benefits macroalgae quite a lot. They prefer the spectrum to be closer to 6,500 K. 10,000 is okay though, so that's what this light is. I think approximately around 10,000 K, and that's a good cover all bases kind of spectrum. Okay, it doesn't make the corals fluoresce as much as say a fully actinic tank would. You get a little bit of fluorescence, so you can see the zoas and the euphyllias and things are glowing a little bit nicely, so it's okay, but also the macroalgae are growing really nicely under this as well. So if you're going to do both, I would say don't go too blue with your lighting. Stick to around 10,000 K. You can have a little bit of blue, so if you're using T5s for instance, you could add one tube of blue, but let's say stay around that 10,000 to 6,500 K lighting range. So the next thing would be about macroalgae choice. So when you're selecting which macroalgae to grow with your corals, you want to be really mindful of how these macroalgae tend to grow. So things like Caulerpa racemosa or other really fast growing Caulerpas like Brachypus and stuff like that, possibly Taxifolia, but I'm on the fence about Taxifolia at the moment, will and can overgrow your corals. So you know, in some aspects of keeping macroalgae, overgrowing your corals does happen, and it's not one that we need to be massively worried about. You can see on this toadstool it's got lots of Gracilaria growing around it, but it's not an issue because the toadstool is growing upwards and outwards and it's not being affected. But if you had something like Euphyllias and you had racemosa growing all over it, it would eventually smother it. I found though that soft corals tend to either deal with being overgrown by macroalgae, or they tend to get out of the way. So like mushrooms and things, they'll move. Once they start getting smothered, they'll move to the next available spot. You'll notice in this tank I've got my corals in a kind of island in the centre, and then I've got my macroalgae around the edge. So that's the design here, is to try and stop the macroalgae overgrowing these corals. So that's just something to be mindful of, something to be aware of. Choose your macroalgae carefully, and also you need to manage them. So don't allow the macroalgae to sort of overgrow and damage the corals. But in general, yeah, keeping them together is really nice, and it adds a different dimension to the tank. I mean, some people just keep macros, some people just keep corals, but you can do both. And there's lots of people as well keeping NPS corals like gorgonians and sun corals and things together, and they just look stunning. And of course those kind of corals really like the water conditions as well that macroalgae present. And that's the next part of the video, is water quality. So soft corals in general like a little bit dirtier water, so that goes really well with macroalgae, because with macroalgae you tend to not run a skimmer, well I don't anyway, which allows a lot of the organics to build up, which feeds the macroalgae to some extent. You also tend, when it's really grown in, you tend to have to add nutrients like nitrates, phosphates, iron, magnesium, molybdenum as well is a big one, and that's something that some certain corals don't like. So if you're trying to keep SPS corals, that's a big no-no. You're not going to be wanting to add phosphate and nitrate. In fact, the opposite. They tend to want to have a lot cleaner water. So I'd say that things like SPS are probably incompatible with keeping macroalgae, although I haven't tried, so I'm not writing it off, but I would just say on paper, SPS corals are probably incompatible. That being said, I have seen people on Instagram keeping SPS corals like Acropora with a mixed macroalgae tank. So I'm not saying it's not possible, just I think it takes a little bit more care and consideration to keep macroalgae with SPS. But at the end of the day, you're only going to find out by trying it out. So give it a go. But things like soft corals, so all your leather corals, all your zoas, xenias and things like that, they love it. Absolutely love it. And they're a match made in heaven. I've actually found that a lot of the time when you add macroalgae to a soft coral tank, the soft corals tend to do better, in fact. And I've read from a research paper, which I can't link because I can't remember where it was, but because of how leaky certain macroalgae are, they tend to leak sugars into the water from their just cells. They're so leaky, and I strongly believe that these sugars are going into the water and they're boosting the corals, because corals will use this as a food source. It's free sugars essentially. And in a tank I did in a shop I worked at, which I'll put up now, the corals in there were stunning, absolutely stunning. And they did better. As soon as I put a coral in this tank with a macro, they flourished. Took the coral out, put it into more of a sterile shop tank where you keep everything low, and they all sort of shrank back a little bit. So I strongly believe that some soft corals do benefit being kept with macroalgae. So basically, yes, give it a go. If you've got a coral tank and it's got all the right stuff in there, bang some macroalgae in there. Obviously be careful. There's plenty of species which don't overgrow. If you're worried about it, just simply avoid Caulerpa and you shouldn't have an issue. There's lots of other things like Gracilarias, there's Cladophora. There's so many species now which you can get hold of that won't actually overgrow and destroy your reef environment, and they all really benefit to the aesthetic of the tank. I feel like macroalgae give you a bit more texture, a bit more colour than just having corals on their own. So thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Once again, thanks for watching and happy fish keeping.